Microphone on? Yes, I think it's on. Good evening, one and all. It's great to be with you here this evening on a very special occasion. You know, I was told I get to speak for maybe a minute and a half, and I'm thinking, well, what do you want me to say? And they say whatever comes to your mind. So I thought I would share something of a personal nature. I've been a parliamentarian now since 1988 is when I was first elected. And for me, politics is all about people. Being there for real people. And over the years, I've gotten the privilege of meeting many different politicians of all different political stripes, of all different levels of government, even in different countries. And I can honestly say from the bottom of my heart, I have never met a politician that is more a people-oriented person. Someone that genuinely cares about people and wants to make a difference than the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. I can tell you, when I got to know him in 2010 and the years that followed in opposition, he talked a lot about ideas. He talked how we can make a difference in the lives of all Canadians. And when it came right down to it, in 2015, when we formed government, within months, we were making a difference. We put a special tax on Canada's 1% wealthiest, so we can give a tax break for the middle class. We increased the guaranteed income supplement. We increased the child care benefit, actually reformed it, literally lifting thousands of seniors and children out of poverty. We brought in things such as the dental care program, the child care program. We did things through the pandemic. We have a Prime Minister, a government that does exactly what it is that a Prime Minister should do, care for real people. All the way through, from the beginning, he would have town halls such as this, because he believes, as he tells his members of Parliament, we represent communities, and we are supposed to bring our community's thoughts to Ottawa, not Ottawa to our communities, but our communities to Ottawa. And the Prime Minister has consistently, through the years, been there in forums like this, meeting with people, and having that relationship that I would suggest to you is second to no other. And I have the experience, and I've had the opportunity to meet with a lot of politicians, as I said. So I thought I would share that story, given I only had a minute and a half to speak. The next person I was going to have come up is to give us a prayer, and that is Sandra Delarond. Sandra, if you would come up, please. Thank you very much. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you. Pretty hard to beat that. So we know the prayers are nonpartisan, and I'm very humbled to be here this evening to be able to share with you. We talk about, one of the things that I have learned is that every word's a prayer and every day is a ceremony. And so when we gather like this, we create a space that is in fact a ceremony. And so each word that we share today is about our prayer. And I want to say as part of that prayer that we recognize this land that we are on as holy land. It's the holy land of our people, the Indigenous people of this country, and it's the land that our ancestors left for all of us. And for many, our ancestors greeted your ancestors to create a home for all of us. And if we live within that world and the world that they left for us as a safe space, so that all of us can work together collectively to create a world for future generations. So the work that we do today is not for ourselves. The work that we do today is to ensure that we leave a world for the future generations. So that is our prayer, the prayer that we hold in our hearts, that we are here to create new relationships, to ask questions, not questions of dissent, but questions of strength, questions with purpose, that we know that there will be a place for the generations to come. So I offer those words as my prayer to all of you, and to hold them in our hearts as we carry on for this evening in this sacred space that we have created. And so in my world, I would say Matakwayasan, which means all my relations. And in many other worlds, it would be Amen. And for my grandmothers, Mary and Lizzie, it's a big Amen. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and Kevin Lamoureux, thank you as well. Tansi, Boshu, bonsoir, chers amis. Good evening, Winnipeg. It's so fantastic to be here. I want to begin by thanking the University of Winnipeg for being so generous with their space, their time, and their energy, and for hosting us this evening. My name's Dan Vandel, by the way. I'm an MP for Saint-Boniface, Saint-Vital. C'est un plaisir d'être ici. J'aimerais remercier tout le monde qui sont ici ce soir pour leur temps, leur dévouement, pour leur engagement vers notre ville, notre province et notre pays, le Canada. I want to talk a little bit about today because it was a very special day. Something incredibly important was announced by the Prime Minister this morning at the Forks on water. As we all know, there is nothing more important than clean air and clean water. It is a pillar of our commitment as a government to Canadians. This morning at the Forks, we announced the location of Canada's first ever water agency here in the city of Winnipeg. Ce matin, à la Fourche, on a annoncé la création de la première agence canadienne nationale de l'eau ici à la ville de Winnipeg. It's something that is an absolute pillar of our platform, a healthy and clean environment. Reconciliation that is based on respect is absolutely essential. Growing the economy, creating long-term sustainable jobs for Canadians is a pillar of our platform. And all of that is being driven by our leader, the 23rd Prime Minister of Canada, le 23e Premier Ministre du Canada, l'Honorable Honorable Justin Trudeau.
Thank you, Dan, for your words and for your hard work, not just in Cabinet, but also as the proud Member of Parliament for Saint-Boniface, Saint-Vital. Kevin, thank you for your words as well. Sandra, Elder, thank you for starting us off in the right way. And thank you, all of you, for coming out tonight. This is really heartwarming to me to see so many people choosing to come out to engage in a political conversation. There's a lot of reasons to be skeptical or even cynical about politics, and all sorts of reasons to have lots of questions about what's going on and how, as a government and as politicians in general, we're responding to the things that matter most to you. But the fact that all of you who had other things to do on a random Wednesday evening chose to come out to be part of a conversation about where we're going as a country, as a community, how we're going to work together to make sure we're building the right future for all of us from coast to coast to coast, is a really encouraging thing, because there's so many reasons to be anxious, so many reasons to be worried about our future. I mean, when you think about what we've gone through in the past few years, it's absolutely unprecedented. The level of challenges we face, first of all, the ongoing challenge of climate change, but that is articulating itself with more and more extreme weather events. I don't have to talk to any Manitobans about flooding, but the wildfires we're seeing, the hurricane we saw just recently in Atlantic Canada, the challenges right across the country. Climate change is real, and it's having a huge impact on our lives, on our communities, and people are rightly worried about the fact that it's just going to get worse in its impacts over the coming decades. Now, we went through a pandemic that threw us all for a loop, caused us to question a whole bunch of things, is still having lingering after effects, not just on our economy and on the challenges of supply chains and inflation, but also on our mental health, on how we're feeling about how we're in our communities, and exacerbated differences and challenges that people have faced when their worlds were turned upside down by things happening on the other side of the planet. We're also dealing with a moment of backsliding of democracy and rise of authoritarian states who are trying to disrupt those democracies. No better example of that than Russia choosing to overturn decades of stability, of a UN charter, of a rules-based international order that said the lines on a map are the lines on a map and you don't get to redraw them by force, and chose to invade a peaceful neighbor. And there's a lot of people who say, oh, you know, it's just a war in Europe. We should be worried about wars everywhere in the world, not just in Europe. But this is a direct challenge to the foundational principles upon which our peace and prosperity everywhere around the world is based right now. Russia is trying to make it so that might becomes right once again. And if you think for a second of any corner of the world where there's a slightly larger neighbor with a slightly larger military, looking at a line on a map that was drawn perhaps in a slightly arbitrary way by colonial powers, and saying, actually, the people on the other side of that river or that other side of that mountain range or that little island there really should belong to our country. And suddenly, you get a potential for chaos in the world that we have to stand up against. That's why 141 countries around the world stood up in support of Ukraine at the UN. Because this is larger than just Ukraine, but it's very much about Ukraine. That we need to continue to stand with Ukraine, stand against Russia, stand against the violation of the UN Charter, and that's also a cause for concern. It's having an impact on food prices and energy prices and constant disruption of global supply chains. So there's a lot coming at us. Right now we're looking at a global economic slowdown at a time where we're still strained on all sorts of different levels. No wonder people are worried about where we're going, about how we're going to get through it. Housing prices are through the roof. Groceries still remain stubbornly high, even as inflation is coming down. And there's a search now for easy answers, for simplistic solutions. Une solution facile qui va tout régler. Un tweet bien tourné. Une vidéo sur TikTok ou sur YouTube qui va tout expliquer. If any of the answers were simple, they'd already have been brought into place. Complex problems, complex challenges have complex solutions and require us all to step up, require us to work hard together to solve them. But the good thing is, that's what Canadians have always been great at. Figuring out how to roll up our sleeves, lean on each other, work together for the betterment of our community and our country, and make it through incredibly difficult challenges. We do that every year. It's called winter. We know how to get through tough times. That's what Canada is. And the ability to remain clear-eyed and optimistic about our future is part of what I wanted to talk with you about tonight. But I'm not going to say much more right now because I'm really looking forward to taking questions from as many of you as I possibly can. So I'm going to try and keep my answers short. I'm terrible at keeping my answers short, but I promise you I will try, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. I'm going to start in this section here, and then I'll just loop my way around the room, and we'll start with that. So does someone have a question for me in this section here? Et bien sûr, vous pouvez poser vos questions en anglais ou en français si vous en avez. Go ahead, ma'am. And what's your name?
Sorry, my name is Billie. First of all, I want to say I'm very proud of you. I'm proud of who you've become. I watched your mom and I watched your dad, and I'm really, really proud of your leadership. I want to commend you for that first. So my question isn't an easy one, and I know it's probably one that you've been challenged with probably in the past. We have another kind of pandemic happening across this country, actually internationally, and that is the loss of lives from addictions. And we face a death here every minute. Every minute there's somebody that's dying from an overdose. And it doesn't matter what cities you go into, what communities. It used to be that there was a stigma that those things were attached to certain families, but now they're in everybody's families and they're in everybody's homes. And it's tragic. What is leadership for a country as well-versed and prominent as ours? What does that look like?
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you, Billie. And you're right that these are tragedies that have hit every family in every part of the country, in every neighborhood. But we also have to know that, as usual, with any crisis or with any huge challenge, it's hitting the most vulnerable hardest. And that's where we really have to start and step up. But nobody is untouched by challenges of addictions, of opioids, of these challenges. I think the first thing is making sure that we understand there is no one answer to it. There is no simple solution. When you look at addictions, even before you start talking about the ways of treating the addictions, we have to understand so often it comes from cycles of trauma, of marginalization, the social determinants of health, housing, employment, a sense of value, identity, language, particularly when you talk about Indigenous peoples who've lost their connection with their ancestors, their elders, their identity, their core because of residential schools and other things that have tried to take away. That leaves people more vulnerable to addictions. So we need to be working on those, whether it's with eliminating boil water advisories, investing in partnerships and self-government and economic reconciliation. All those things are part of it. But if we're going to get down to the actual challenge of addictions, it's time we stopped treating addiction as a criminal justice issue and dealt with it as a health issue. And I'll be honest, that's tough right now. That's tough right now because people are scared. People look at increasing violence in public transit, in cities across the country, so much of it tied to mental health challenges, so much of it tied to criminal justice systems, overworked and churning through, some of which is tied as well to poverty. And it's easy to sort of say, okay, we just need to keep with a criminal justice and keep punishing people and keep them out of society on the margins of society if, they are addicted and unable to be helped. Well, that's the wrong approach. Years and decades of trying variations on that has only made it worse. So we do have to be grounded in science and evidence. And whether it's safe consumption sites or harm reduction programs, looking at what the best data and the best research is into how to help people from staying away from the toxic drug supplies that are out there. Being an addict shouldn't be a death sentence. Unfortunately, it's close to that now in some parts of the country where the availability of toxic drugs is a huge problem. And unfortunately, here's an example where, there are some politicians who are falling back on simple common sense and fear and say, well, these are just bad people, or the approach doesn't work because unfortunately it's continuing and harm reduction hasn't worked. Well, it has. It is saving lives. And we need to continue to be grounded in a responsible, evidence-based, science-based, not an ideological, not a popular approach to it, but a compassionate, scientific, health-based approach to dealing with addictions, even as we work on the international stage to interdict the flow of drugs, whether it's fentanyl or carfentanil or others. Whether it's making sure we're strengthening our border measures, whether it's making sure, there's a broad range of approaches we have to take to it, and this government's going to continue to do that, but we will, every step of the way, be grounded in two principles: compassion and science. Thank you very much. Thank you, Billie. Another question? Yes, you, go ahead.
Alors, bonsoir, Monsieur le Premier Ministre.
Bonsoir.
Mon nom, c'est Marie-Paul. So, I am the chairperson of the Canadian Federation of Students in Manitoba, and I wanted to ask a question. So, we all saw that the government actually temporarily allowed international students to work more than 20 hours, and I think we can all see, I guess the KPI and the metric will show that it actually helped the Canadian workforce, because we already have people on ground who have Canadian experience and all of that working right away in different industry, whether it's healthcare or anything else we can think about. So my first question will be, it's a question in with two wings, if I can call it like that. So the first one will be, will the government consider making this a permanent measure? And the second one is, will the government consider creating, let's say, a PR pathway that is very comprehensive for people in Canada? What I mean by that is that when you apply for PR, there are different, let's say, I call them barriers because this is what they are. For people that already live here, for instance, they have to take a language test. And for me, it's like somebody that's been living in Canada for so long, at least speaks English or French. I do speak both. So I don't really see maybe the reason why we still have the language test that is there, knowing that it costs anywhere between $300 and plus, $300 to $400. So that's another barrier that make people kind of hold on to applying for PR. So I think it would be great if we can look into that, because we already have the workforce on ground. They have the experience. They are qualified, studied in well-renowned Canadian universities. So that's something that we can explore. So wanted to know if that would be an option. Merci beaucoup.
Ça me fait plaisir. Merci pour la question. International students should all have pathways to citizenship. It just makes sense. We need to continue to welcome in people from around the world to continue to grow our economy. One of the advantages Canada has over other G7 nations is we actually have a growing population at a faster rate because Canadians remain positively inclined towards immigration. Canadians understand that immigration creates jobs, creates prosperity. Even when you talk about the housing crisis that we're facing, which we are facing, one of the limits on creating more housing is the challenges on having enough construction workers, and immigration could be a solution to that as well when we bring in skilled workers and skilled trades. So we need more immigration, and international students have Canadian experience. They've been here for a while. They've gone through our education system by definition, so they have relevant skills, and they already have a place to live if they're in Canada. They're already here. There's no travel. So we are absolutely accelerating and strengthening pathways to permanent residency for international students. The other part of it around expanding workplace opportunities and hours of work, we're always trying to get that balance right. international students should be able to contribute, but we do want to make sure that you're coming here as an international student to study, and it's not a backdoor way of getting a work permit. So there have to be certain limits around that. And that's sort of a theme that goes through our immigration system, that one of the things that I think is really important to protect as a country is the fact that Canadians are positively inclined towards immigration. And one of the ways of guaranteeing that is to show that we have a strong system that applies, that is fair, and that is applied across the country in rigorous ways. And when people know that immigration is done in a responsible, orderly fashion, then Canadians can remain super positive about it. And that's what we need, and that's a comparative advantage that Canada has over other countries where people are turning their back on immigration, even at a time where the entire world is facing labor shortages in all sorts of ways. It's just less in Canada because we can continue to draw on people from around the world. Alors, merci beaucoup pour cette question. Come to this section. Who's got a question here? Yes, you in red. Yep, stand up.
Hello, welcome to Winnipeg. My name is Victoria Romero. I'm a fourth-year student at the University of Manitoba, a social justice activist, and I also just completed my term as the Vice President Advocacy at the University of Manitoba Students' Union.
Congratulations.
So, thank you. And through this work, I work directly to urge all levels of government to address the ongoing mental health crisis. In 2021, the Liberals made a platform promise to create a fund of $500 million over 4 years for post-secondary mental health supports. And while we've seen a lot of great policy around mental health from this government, this specific one has yet to be fulfilled. I was just wondering, what is the plan to address this and fulfill this promise to create this mental health fund for students?
Oh, thank you, Victoria. You know, one of the things that has always impacted me the most, since I've been doing these town halls since before I was Prime Minister, but consistently, every town hall I get a question on mental health, usually early on, and almost always from a young person. It is young people who are driving the conversation around mental health, around destigmatization, around dealing with it, and you need to be supported and saluted in that. Thank you for that advocacy. It's really, really important. Mental health is health. For too long, our healthcare systems have segmented out or looked at an institutional model around mental health when we know that engaging in a comprehensive way, particularly around young people, is incredibly important. If you can support someone in the 15 to 25-year-old range as they begin, in many cases, their first struggles with mental health, then you give them the tools to be more successful, more achieving their potential, more able to deal with those challenges throughout the course of their life. And that's why we specifically targeted supporting in universities and moving forward on that. We have brought forward certain programs around universities, but the large thing that we always run into as a federal government is the federal government's not in charge of delivery of healthcare. Those are the provinces. And the federal government has two big roles around health. One is to participate in the funding of healthcare services across the country. And two is to make sure that healthcare right across the country follows the principles and the guidelines of the Canada Health Act, which means public, universally accessible services across the country. We need to have a public healthcare system in this country. So after the pandemic, where we saw that there were such challenges around delivery of healthcare right across the country that the pandemic exacerbated, we realized that we needed to encourage results from healthcare delivery across the country. Now, the way our country works doesn't mean the federal government is the boss of the provinces, or the boss of the municipalities, and so forth. We're not hierarchical. The federal government and the provincial governments deal with different things within the Constitution. And I don't get to tell the Premier what to do in provincial areas of jurisdiction. So we have to figure out other ways of doing it. One of the things we did earlier this year when we signed historic close to $200 billion in healthcare funding over the next 10 years is instead of, holding strings on it, which would be unconstitutional or the wrong way of going about it, we demanded a level of transparency and accountability, not to us, but to Canadians, with proper data collection, proper metrics, so that Canadians who pay taxes both to the federal level and the provincial level can know that they're getting actual improvements and results from investments in healthcare systems. And one of the ways we did that was to focus on 4 distinct areas. The first one is making sure that as we flow this money, there's a level of data integrity and transparency and accountability and metrics, both for individual health data. So when you go to the emergency room, people can actually see your case, your file, and actually access your medical records in a way that can save your life. And 2, exchange of data across jurisdictions, so that if you're on vacation or if you move across the country, or just if you want to compare outcomes from how your province is doing on healthcare to how a different province is doing on healthcare and in which area is healthcare, there's transparency around that. So that's the big one. The second one is access to family doctors. We know that when people have a family doctor, health outcomes throughout the entire system are far better. So we need to get those numbers up. We're investing in support for frontline health workers because we've seen the crisis, the burnout, the exhaustion over the past few years of our nurses, our doctors, our frontline healthcare workers who are not getting that relief. And there's things we're doing around international certification, pan-Canadian licensing that are pushing us in the right direction, but we need to do more on that. That's 3. And the 4th is around mental health, making sure that there are dedicated focuses on mental health delivery. And part of that is going to be within universities. So it's something we do have to and will work with the provinces on, but it's also something because of the data collection, because of the level of accountability that we're demanding, not for the federal government, but for all Canadians from healthcare systems. It's going to be something you, Victoria, and others are going to be able to follow closely and make sure that that money does get to where it's needed. So thank you very much for that question. All right, question. You, sir, in the blue shirt. Yep.
Hello, everyone. My name is Afrasiab, and I am a first-year neuroscience student here at the University of Winnipeg. As we all know, we are heading into a recession, and I would like to know what the Liberal Party of Canada has planned to support emerging entrepreneurs and small businesses such as myself to stay afloat and manage the emerging cost of living.
Great question, but I'm actually going to disagree with you. There is no question that the world is headed for troubled economic waters. There's going to be a global slowdown. Whether that actually translates into a recession is not entirely sure, and whether that translates into a recession in Canada is not entirely sure. One of the reasons is this post-COVID economics we tend to be in right now is sort of defying a lot of the traditional analysis that has been applied to it. And what we're seeing is recessions are painful traditionally and usually because they come with job losses, massive job losses. You know, when the economy takes a downturn, businesses lay off a whole bunch of people, mills shut down, factories go into 1 or 2 shifts from their 3 shifts, and people get laid off, and then they have trouble paying their mortgages, lose their homes. That's the classic consequences of a recession. We are not sure that even if there is a recession in Canada, that it's going to be accompanied by job losses or massive job losses. And that's because we're right now in a position where there's a labor shortage. And there are fundamentals in the job market that are stronger and different than before. But that doesn't mean, for a second, that the global economic slowdown that's coming won't have an impact. We're already seeing the impact on people's lives of inflation, of higher interest rates to try and curb inflation, of disrupted supply chains, of high housing prices and rent prices that are really putting a huge stress and burden on a whole bunch of families across the country, across the income range. And one of the things that we've been constrained with as a government is the understanding that even if inflation is really hurting people, the solution of just trying to send people money, for example, to help them with the rising costs of everything, would actually just feed inflation even more, and you get into a spiral of worsening inflation. And inflation ends up hurting everyone. So one of the things that we took as an approach in the fall, and are continuing to take now, is a really targeted approach on who needs the best help. We doubled the GST credit, which goes to 11 million Canadians across the country in the fall. That was targeted help. We targeted a top-up to the rental benefit, the housing benefit, that helps the lowest income renters with an extra $500. We did that in the fall. And now we announced in our latest budget a grocery rebate. It's going to give hundreds of dollars, again, to people who actually need it, that should arrive in the early July, because that was something at least we could get support on from all of Parliament on. But we're also moving forward on other ways that are contributing that won't necessarily add to inflation. The dental benefit that's coming in will make a huge difference on families with kids who couldn't afford to send their kids to the dentist, or had to forego other things so that their kids could go to the dentist. Well, now we're covering dental care for those families, and that's going to be a big relief as well. The Canada Child Benefit that delivers hundreds of dollars a month to families that need the help because it's means tested, but low-income and middle-class families. And that's going to go up significantly in July. Even the climate action incentive, which is worth $1,000, more than $1,000 for the family of four. That climate action incentive, nobody knows what that is. It's the rebate you get from the target carbon tax. We brought in a carbon tax that raises the price on a number of things associated with fuel. The climate incentive, over $1,000 a year for a family of four in Manitoba, more than offsets the increase of the carbon price. So the average family in Manitoba is better off with that, with more money in their pocket. So there's all sorts of different ways we're targeting to make sure that on the cost of living, we're supporting. But we need to do more than that. That's why we're working with municipalities to build more housing. That's why we're working to smooth out our supply chains. That's why we're investing to draw in more international investments, to work on critical minerals, to move forward on manufacturing. There's lots of things we're doing. The bottom line, though, is Canada has a fiscal position, the lowest deficit in the G7, the best debt as a size of our economy ratio in the G7, which means we have the fiscal room that if things do take a turn for the worse in the coming months, we will be able to step up from a position of strength and be there to help people who need it. And that lesson of being there to help people who need it is actually the lesson of the pandemic. We faced a situation where everyone needed help, and we stepped up with the wage subsidy, with the CERB. And what that did is it allowed people to hold through an incredibly difficult time. Not ideal, but it helped. And it meant that our economy bounced back faster after the pandemic. That and the fact that 90% of Canadians got double vaccinated or thereabouts also made sure that we had a less bad pandemic than other people around the world. And we came back quicker because we were there for each other, and our economy's doing better than many others in the world. And there, right there, is the proof point that the best way to grow the economy isn't to sit back and wait for trickle down, give tax breaks and advantages to the wealthiest and hope that they create jobs for everyone else, but to put the money in the pockets of the people who need it, who can invest, grow, invest in themselves, their own education, and create success from the bottom up and the middle out. And that approach is what we're going to continue to do, and that's how we're going to help you as a budding entrepreneur able to afford your rent and build those next generations of solutions that our communities are going to need. Thank you. And one more question from you, and then I'll go to here afterwards.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, to be in Winnipeg, and thank you for all the Winnipeggers to be here to listen to our Prime Minister. My question, my name is Zora. My name is Zora Kant, and I'm an immigration consultant from 13 years from Winnipeg, Toronto, and Calgary. So my question is related to immigration. I have two parts of question. One part is related to parents and grandparents program. We have a quota of about 30,000 applications, and the people who are waiting in this program is about over 150,000 families. So will immigration is considering to increase the quota in this program? That is question number one. The question number two is, there are lots of international students are moving from Ontario to Manitoba, and nothing is happening for them in Manitoba. So they are moving to Saskatchewan, some are moving to Prince Edward Island, and somewhere else. So is there any hope from the immigration? Will they give them any kind of peer-to-peer pathway so they can get their dream to be a permanent resident of this great country?
Sorry, I have a question for you. No, leave him the mic. International students come to study at a particular university or institution. They come for a particular program.
That's right.
What do you mean they're moving across the country?
Because in Ontario, there is an Ontario Provincial Nominee Program, which is really hard for them to get nominated. So,
but that's different from an international students program.
No, but let's say somebody moved from India, yes, and he did a hospitality program 2 years, let's say, Seneca College, and
okay,
and then he tried some jobs in Ontario.
Oh, sorry, and he completed
the studies.
Okay.
Yeah, and he's on a postgrad work permit.
Okay.
And after having a postgrad work permit, they find out Ontario is not the place for them to get immigrated,
yep,
and they move to Manitoba. But in Manitoba, the cutoff is really high. Now they are moving to Saskatchewan, some are moving to Prince Edward Island, and some are losing their even hope. They are thinking, why not to go to India, because there is no hope. So why not, being the champion in immigration, and somebody in Punjab say Justin Trudeau. So why not, helping these young individuals? Thank you.
Oh, excellent questions. No, thank you, Zorb. First of all, family reunification is part of Canada's advantage in terms of immigration. There's lots of countries in the world that want workers to come in. Not as many countries in the world that are saying workers can come in and you can sponsor your parents and you can sponsor your whole family, because we want you not just to be contributing as a worker, we want you to be contributing as a Canadian, as a family, as a community. And that's why we have significantly increased the levels of family reunification, but it's always a balance. We have to figure out that balance. We cannot take in infinite amounts of people every year, obviously, even with all the space we have. We need, we are limited by processing time, by housing availability, by job availability, all sorts of things, and we have to make sure that it makes sense in terms of the settlement that we're having. So we've established that. We're going to continue to look at how we can be more generous, including on family reunification, but we do need to make sure we're getting that balance right around workers, around refugees, around economic investors and immigrants, and around families. And it'll never be perfect, and every time someone will have a story that says, oh, I really wish you were able to do this. We have a system we're constantly trying to improve and align, but it's challenging. And one of those challenges that you point out is the need for, once you're graduating, to show that ability to get a job, even as an international student with a Canadian college degree or certificate. We're already moving forward, or we're starting to move forward on projects that don't require Canadian experience before you can get licensed. I saw the Ontario College of Engineers, I believe, is saying you don't need to have Canadian experience before you become before you can join the College of Engineers. That's a step in the right direction, but we're going to have to do a better job of making sure the people who graduate from Canadian schools are able to get jobs in their field. But part of that is also going to involve making sure we're directing or encouraging people to go into fields of study that lead to availability of jobs. If you're training in an area where we don't have that many jobs available, can we direct you into an area where we are going to need more jobs? That kind of approach is going to be good for us as a country as well. So those are the things we're going to look for. All right, question from this section here. How about you? Yep. Stand up. Yep. Right there.
Hello, so my name is Amanj. I am currently in grade 9, and I have a question for you. Why is it that every time that I go outside, I see people without a home, without a place to live, and no chance to have a guaranteed dinner? Why can't we as a government or as a nation help provide for these people by taxing people with more income or large corporations to help these people eat and be a great citizen of Canada?
Thank you. Thank you, Amansh, for your question. It is heartbreaking to see the increasing challenges of homelessness across the country. We're supposed to be going in the other direction, and we were starting to go in the other direction before the pandemic, and that made everything worse, and we lost a lot of ground. But we're getting back onto that track. It's one of those issues that, unfortunately, doesn't have a simple solution. There's no one thing we can do because, of course, every individual has a different story, a different experience, slightly different needs. Yes, there are broad strokes and patterns that we can go at, and that's something we certainly do. But it's also something that requires partnership between all three orders of government. The federal government has initiatives to put forward to support municipalities and provinces deal with the homelessness challenges. Provinces have programs to put forward as well, and municipalities are often stepping up because they have the most proximal tools on that. But you're right, at the base of it, a country as wealthy as Canada shouldn't have anyone sleeping in the streets, particularly not in Canadian winters, particularly not in Canadian winters in Winnipeg, and yet it happens all the time, every night. There are immediate short-term supports. During the pandemic, we stepped up massively to give more funding to shelters so that they could adjust to COVID protocols. We invested in supporting better solutions in the immediate that were sort of Band-Aids. But we're also investing massively in, for example, the Rapid Housing Initiative, which is designed, came out of COVID, but it was more than that. It was designed to help provinces or municipalities purchase, for example, some of those unused hotels that weren't being used in COVID and convert them into affordable rental units. It was a stopgap measure that ended up being so successful in flowing money to municipalities with either modular housing or prefabricated housing or converting existing buildings like hotels into residences, that we did it once, we did it again. We're now on the third time investing directly in cities in the Rapid Housing Initiative because that's working. But that's one model of things. We've got a Housing First program as well that's designed to go after chronic homelessness and hopefully eliminate it entirely in the coming years. But if you want to do that, it's more than just finding a house or a home or an apartment and making sure it's affordable, although that's a piece of it. In many cases, it means finding supports for mental health challenges that maybe people have developed living in the streets, or maybe were part of the reason people end up in the streets in the first place. With the large numbers of Indigenous homeless populations, getting them back to culturally sensitive, trauma-informed supports, reconnecting them with language, reconnecting them with land, reconnecting them with elders, reconnecting them with a community that they can feel part of and valued in. This is part of it. And for that requires not solutions from Ottawa, but solutions built with Indigenous leadership and Indigenous communities. Maybe there's job training. Maybe there's dealing with childhood trauma from terrible experiences growing up. There are layers that we have to be there with wraparound services. How to manage a bank account, how to shop for healthy food, how to all sorts of things that people may have different challenges on. And that's where investing in social programs, frontline workers, making sure that they get the proper resources to be able to flow that is the compassionate and responsible approach. Unfortunately, in politics, all too often the focus has been on, okay, let's just move them so they're less visible to a different part of the community so the voting base doesn't see it. Keep the streets clean, but create ghettos. That's an approach that has been tried too many times in too many places and does not work. It's counterproductive. And that's where taking an approach that is more thoughtful, consistent in its investment. So many of our community organizations keep having to apply with new programs every year because every politician likes to announce a shiny new program and cut a ribbon instead of just giving continual base funding to an organization that's doing great work year in and year out. That's a model that we have to work on both at the federal level and particularly at the provincial level, where the approaches aren't always as compassionate and trauma-informed as they are in different parts of the country. So, yeah, I'm trying to be nice here, but that's where the choices we make as communities are really important, and it is something that we are committed to addressing and solving and fixing, but it's a long haul for all of us. But you're right, there's no reason a wealthy country like Canada should continue to have people living in the streets. Okay, another question. Yes, you. Stand up.
Thank you. Hi everyone, students, presents, members here, Justin. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cecibel Coronel. I'm an immigrant, as you can tell by my accent. So here in Canada, for every 100,000 citizens, there are only 95 psychologists. And for every 100,000 Canadians, we just have 13.2 psychiatrists. Because without mental health, there is no health. And the waiting list for a single psychiatrist is 7 months. Let's don't go very far. Outside of these doors, the Portage Place, it's well known for stabbings, homeless, domestic abuse, addictions. So how can we sit here, talk about mental health, addictions, when so many people cannot afford $200 per session? Because mental health shouldn't be a privilege. How can we make mental health accessible to everyone? And how can we, as individuals here, sit down, make an impact, not as an individual, but for all the community? Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Cecibel. It's a great question. I don't want to repeat what I said earlier on funding that the federal government is sending to provinces that will focus on mental health and require them to share their numbers so that people can look at those stats and see what's changes. But I will pick up on what's changing and improving. But I will pick up on two things that you mentioned in there. The first one is the fact that there is a shortage of psychiatrists and psychologists. We need to make sure that people are accessing the right kind of mental health supports for them. Some people just may need more of a coach. Some people may need a full cognitive therapist and drugs, and others may need something in between. Some may need a psychologist supports. We need to make sure we are creating a much more resilient and diverse network of supports on mental health. A well-placed school counselor or nurse can have a bigger impact on a 16-year-old than the psychiatrist at age 24 on that same young person that comes at it 8 years later. So how we look at making sure we're wrapping around mental health services in an appropriate way for people, for Indigenous peoples or cultural communities, making sure that there is informed, diversely informed supports. Maybe for an Indigenous community, it's an elder. Maybe from someone from an immigrant community, it's someone from that own community who can understand their experiences, but without having too much formal training. We have to do a lot better at figuring out how to best help someone in the most efficient and rapid way. And as we look at that, as we look at the different ways of approaching mental health care, we actually start finding more solutions on that. So I entirely agree on that. The other thing you asked about is how can we, as individuals, make sure we're contributing to a healthy community and a more resilient mentally healthy society? Well, understanding that a lot of us may have taken CPR courses, and a lot of us may know different types of first aid, but how many of us are properly trained in mental health first aid? If someone has a panic attack in the line for a movie theater or at the bank, how many people would know how to intervene and give that person the support they need? And more than that, what about proactive mental health instead of reactive mental health? Can we train up bank tellers and barbers and people, the checkout clerk at the local grocery store or the bag boy, to be able to engage with their fellow citizens in a way that supports collective mental health? We can build in that resilience in our society, in our community, if we do a better job of talking about it, teaching it, of training in it, and make sure that we're all there and we understand that as social animals, human beings rely on those interactions with others, even complete strangers, to make their way through their day and through their life. If we can be better informed about how we can support each other, not only do we help others, we help ourselves as well. The isolation and the toxicity that we can surround ourselves in this modern world would do well to be responded with a little more outreach, a little more engagement. So there's lots of things we can do to create a more resilient, healthy society. And it starts by encouraging people to be empathetic, to reach out, to understand, to seek to understand each other, to listen to each other, to hear each other, and to share ourselves. So in addition to everything I said before on more funding for mental health and more clear metrics in healthcare delivery, there's lots of things we can do to create a more resilient, mentally healthy society as well. Thank you, Isabel, for your question. Question from here. Yes, you in the front.
Miigwech. My name is Mayangan Linklater. Dear Prime Minister Mr. Trudeau, on October 27, 2022, the House of Commons passed the following motion with unanimous consent. That in the opinion of the House, that the government must recognize what happened in Canada's Indian residential schools as genocide, as acknowledged by Pope Francis and in accordance with Article 2 of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. As Prime Minister, will the Government of Canada recognize Canada's Indian residential school genocide on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, September 30th, 2023? Miigwech, Wapito, Igose.
Thank you very much, Mangan. Canada failed as a country, the people who've lived here forever. When settlers first arrived in this land, there were promises made about being stewards together, partners on this land, and we broke those treaties. We broke the implicit understandings, and we tried to erase the cultures and the communities that had been here for millennia, that received us with open arms, because that was the tradition, and that was the approach. The impacts of residential schools, of trying to assimilate, and devalue, and eliminate Indigenous identity and culture, fortunately failed. But it had horrific consequences. And it's not just something of the past. It's something that is real today, every day. Intergenerational trauma, the impacts, whether it's in the justice system or in incarceration rates or in mental health and addiction problems, or just in economic opportunity. The impacts of things that happened a generation ago or 2 generations ago or 100 years ago are real today in our everyday lives. So when people ask for, or people say, well, why do you keep talking about things that happened in the past? It's because they didn't happen just in the past, they happen today. And that's why understanding the responsibility that Canada has for that, and I've used the word genocide, and I will continue to use the word genocide. But that's not at the heart of it. That's an important recognition. But the important question is, what do we do about it now? How do we ensure that the colonial thinking, the oppression, the devaluing of identity gets reversed? Because at a time where we're talking about the need to bring people together in community, to end the isolation that so many people feel that lead to so much mental health challenges. I'm not just talking about the Indigenous population, I'm talking about all Canadians. To deal with becoming proper stewards of the earth and not destroying our environment. The kinds of thinking that Indigenous people had figured out long before settlers ever showed up to try and end up throwing everything out of whack, is more important for our collective survival now than it's ever been. And for people who say that reconciliation is between the federal government or orders of government and Indigenous peoples, and that's where it has to happen, do not understand that it's about each and every one of us living in this country. To put it clearly, even as residential schools were taking Indigenous kids from their families, denying them their language, their culture, denying them the experience of knowing what parenting is, or being parented is, erasing languages and culture. Even as that was happening to Indigenous kids, where residential schools were drilling into them that their language, their identity, their culture had no value. Every other school in this country was teaching non-Indigenous kids the same thing. In any high school across the country, looking at history lessons, what was being taught was Indigenous people who lived on this land were here before civilization before settlers came and civilized it and built roads in the future, and Indigenous languages or culture or traditional knowledge or identity had no value. So it's all of us who live on this land who need to understand that the way we think about it, the way we think about reconciliation and Indigenous people, is grounded in the kind of colonial teachings that still percolate through the back of our own minds and our own biases, less and less as generations go on and wake up, but certainly through all our institutions, governments, academic institutions, businesses. There are ways of thinking that are tied in to the fact that the messages that in residential schools were set up to teach and to rip away from Indigenous people, they were also teaching and taking from everyone else in an understanding of the kind of partnership we need to move forward. So yes, we will continue to call things what they are. We will continue to deal with it, but mostly we will continue to walk this pathway of reconciliation, understanding that it's a journey, not a destination, and that undoing generations and centuries of trauma is going to take time, but is also incredibly urgent, and is something we all need to be part of, whether we've been in Canada for 10 generations, whether we've been in Canada for millennia, or whether we arrived here a few weeks ago or a few years ago. This is our collective responsibility, all of us who share this land. Thank you for your question. Yes.
Tanse, Ketatamska Tinanoch. Hello, I greet you today. Nina Cameron Adams, Nittisinikasan. My name is Cameron Adams. I'm a final year education student here at the University of Winnipeg, headed for my Master's of Arts in Indigenous Language Revitalization at McGill in September. So I'm really excited for that. A question regarding that I've always had, and something over the last 7 years I've seen a lot from your government doing, is regarding Indigenous language revitalization. As an educator, soon-to-be educator myself, I see the role of Indigenous languages as something that's going to lead us into the future and provide us for prosperity, non-Indigenous and Indigenous alike in Canada, as a roadmap for the future. Something also I see in my daily life, learning the Swampy Cree language, as well as Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, is the competition or the influence that English and French also have with Indigenous languages, and how they pressure Indigenous languages, the speakers, and our access to services, education, healthcare, and different things all in our daily life. My question for you is, how can we help make equitable access for Indigenous languages in Canada in all sectors, so that we can really reintroduce first language speakers that carry on into our future, so that we don't come to a road end where we see our languages in books, but also in limited pockets. I want to see like an Indigenous Canada where everyone can see the value and the prosperity of Indigenous languages and our identities. That's my question for you, Susquatskin and Askomitten. I thank you so much, and look forward to it.
Thank you for your question. I don't have the answer. I don't have the answer because the federal government can't have the answer. I mean, I share the goal, absolutely, and that's why we co-developed C91 with Indigenous peoples across this country to protect Indigenous languages and to try and move that path forward. But I'm not the person to say how to do it. You need to help me with that. And language speakers and people who want to speak their Indigenous language, and people who should want to speak their Indigenous languages but have never had the opportunity to, need to do it, need to be part of it. We, as a federal government, need to be there to create the funding and the opportunities and have the resources so that you can create those programs that will be different for Mi'kmaq or Inuit or Dakota or wherever, or Dene or wherever. But we need to share as a goal, and we need to say as a government, which we have, there is foundational value to our country in ensuring that people can speak and hold on to the languages of their culture, the languages of their identity. I'll never forget one of the first conversations I had with Paul Martin when I was just starting to run. He was a former Prime Minister who's been very, very involved in Indigenous issues. And we were talking about Indigenous youth. And I mentioned the rate of suicide in Indigenous communities for young people and just how devastating it was, how much higher it was in Indigenous communities, youth suicide, than non-Indigenous communities. And he said, yes, it's a horrific problem, but there's something interesting that he had noticed, was that there are some Indigenous communities that actually have lower rates of suicide, youth suicide, than non-Indigenous communities across the country. I said, well, what's the difference? What's the tell? Those Indigenous communities that have been able to preserve language, culture, and identity, and traditional learnings, and living off the land, and have good connections with elders, and all those things that go to core identity, do better. And it's obvious to a certain extent. When you know who you are, you know where you're coming from, you're proud of who you are, you're proud of the things that make you distinct from everyone else, that has value. Well, that's a game changer. And Canada is a place where we should be able to figure that out. Yes, we have two official languages, English and French, which for historical reasons are the two languages that we all figure out how to get along in common in. But it's really important for communities that have come to this country over the past generations to be able to preserve that rich tapestry of diversity, of multiculturalism that is Canada. I mean, third and fourth generation Ukrainian Canadians, or Italian Canadians, or Kenyan Canadians can speak their languages and preserve those languages as part of their culture that adds to Canada. Well, if we've been able to figure that out for multicultural communities, so much more important it is to preserve that for the languages that have been of this land from time immemorial, particularly because it's so wrapped up in so many other challenges that we're facing. So I thank you, Cameron, for stepping up and devoting your studies and hopefully your future to protecting and preserving Indigenous languages, because it's more than just a cultural respect thing to be able to speak a language. It goes to the core of identity. I'm a Quebecer. I understand how language is core to identity. But even I don't come close to the understanding that there is in Indigenous communities of how much language is core to everything. Thank you, Miigwech. Time for me to go up to the back somewhere. So where's the question? How about you in the aisle in the green shoes there? Yeah, there you go. Stand up.
Hello, I'm Bianca. I'm in my third year in the University of Winnipeg, and I'm a two-spirited trans woman that finds it very difficult in Winnipeg to be me. So I have a question. I'm horrified by what is going on down south with the erasure of who we are and the constant nagging on certain aspects of our lives, pretty much demonizing and making us feel that we're irrelevant in this world. Well, I'm 45 years old and I've been around the block. And so I'm watching in Canada, and I want to know, how is your government going to protect people and our youth who are watching this all unfold down south and watching some of the cabinet ministers within our own country come after certain people of the Two-Spirit community? And it's just scary, and I just want to clarify that you have a plan that is going to protect all Canadians without leaving some of them out.
Thank you. Thank you, Bianca, for your question, for standing up and asking it today. It's scary. It's scary to see what's happening in the United States. It's scary to see a country that was founded centuries ago as with the ideals of freedom and democracy in its almost most utopic forms, despite the real challenges of who got to be a voting citizen and slave ownership at the origins of the United States. But that ideal that everyone was created equal, that eventually was hard won through the latter half of the 20th century in many senses, start to turn its back on that. Whether it's 2S LGBTQI+ rights that are constantly being attacked, whether it's women's rights, seeing the clock turned back. I mean, generations of women marched on the US Capitol to fight for rights that are now slipping. Something's happening. And Canada is not immune to that. We're a little more resilient to it for now. But what's happening in the United States is bleeding into political discourse in Canada. Whether it's the attacks we're seeing on drag readings in libraries, for example, that we saw just a few months ago. Whether it's the horrific attacks on 2S LGBTQI+ rights that we're seeing in, we saw it recently here in Manitoba and Brandon. And I would love to tell you that no Canadian government would ever let that happen. But I can't. I can tell you, my government will never let it happen. My government will always stand up unequivocally for women's rights, for 2S LGBTQI+ rights, for the freedoms guaranteed in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for people to be who they are, to love whom they love, to practice the religion that they have. And I've had really interesting and intense debates. I remember in 2015, debates over the wearing of a niqab with feminist friends from Quebec. who explained to me that a niqab or even a hijab is a symbol of oppression of women, and therefore we shouldn't allow it in our country. And I sort of said, well, it's not for a government to tell a woman what she can or cannot wear. And there's a difficult and challenging debate in there, but I know I'm on the right side of it. If only for the practical reason of if you tell a woman she can't go outside wearing a niqab because her husband or her father is forcing her to wear that, what happens to her? Well, she has to stay at home and be even further isolated from society, and she's not allowed out to actually see. I mean, there's all sorts. I'm getting off track a little bit. But the principles of standing up for people's fundamental rights is one that should be non-negotiable, but is suddenly starting to be negotiated once again. The preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause that we're beginning to see in various places across the country. The notwithstanding clause basically allows the provincial government to say, in spite of the fact that the Charter is there to protect people's rights, I'm going to bring in this law that oppresses certain categories of people because it's popular. And the courts can't do a damn thing about it. That's something we should all be really worried about. But the rise of the carefully clevered politics of division, of exclusion, of picking and choosing who you want to reach out to, and who you want to run against, is weakening the fabric of our democracy. And it's something we're seeing around the world. Bianca, I will stand with you. And it is my belief that Canadians will continue to be thoughtful in how they vote and in how they engage with others, to make sure that everyone knows that in standing up for your rights, we're standing up for our own rights as well. That as soon as we start discriminating against and marginalizing someone else for their identity, we're making vulnerable ourselves. And there are huge narratives out there that that's somehow a threat to our country, to recognize diversity, to embrace intersectionality, to understand that resilience in nature and in communities comes from diversity, not identity, not similarity. And making sure that you are not just tolerated, but embraced and accepted as a valuable member of community and of country is something that we're going to have to remain vigilant on. We cannot take for granted anymore that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. And the tools out there of anger, of envy, of toxicity, of fear are very powerful. And what we as Canadians, all of us, are going to have to be thoughtful about is how to recognize it, like we recognize misinformation and disinformation on the internet, why we recognize when an ad is trying to sell us something. We're going to have to be acutely interested and critical about what politicians are trying to sell us, because it's not that far from where we are here in Canada to what we're seeing every day with books being banned in the southern United States. So I'm counting on Canadians to stand together, because there is nothing one government can do that another government can't undo. That's the way our democracy works. So we can't for a second take for granted the freedoms and the rights that we all have as Canadians. That's the cautionary tale of the United States, and that's why I'm so glad you're here with us tonight to remind us of that. Thank you, Bianca. I'm proud to be an ally. I'll come down here for a question now. You, sir.
My name is Bhagwant Mukher. It's my great pleasure and opportunity to speak to the Prime Minister of Canada. Well, every aspect on the health care is discussed, but back to 2018 or 19, there was a minister for seniors to visit to the Winnipeg. She mentioned that nothing has been done so far about the dental care plan, which is most important for the seniors, and she made a note of it that she's going to put it to the government of Canada, because some provincial government already have this facility, but not to all. This should be same in all the provincial governments. So this must be looked into it, which is most important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uncle. We actually just moved forward on dental. It was a mistake, or it was an oversight decades ago that dental care wasn't included in health care. It was seen as something separate, but we now know that mouth health is health. It affects everything else from heart disease to mental health to everything. So we are moving forward as a government. We brought forward a program as of last year. Already over 250,000 kids have benefited from it. Kids under 12 whose parents make under $90,000 a year and who don't have access to dental health insurance now are covered for dental health. But we're moving forward by early next year. We're going to have kids under 18 and seniors able to access who are under a certain income threshold and don't have existing dental health coverage, and adding in Canadians with disabilities, and then moving forward in the coming few years to making sure that every Canadian who can't afford dental care, who doesn't have coverage and makes under a certain threshold, has dental care. So it's something we are moving forward on because it's foundational, and it's something that, well, quite frankly, in a country like Canada, you shouldn't be able to look at someone and judge from their smile how much money their parents made. That's what we're changing. Thank you very much. Yes, there's a group of you sitting right there. So one of you. Okay, sorry, I saw you with the stripes first, so it'll be you. There you go.
My name is Temi. I'm a second-year neuroscience international student at the University of Winnipeg. So recently, I've been having a lot of friends that have been sick or having healthcare problems but haven't been able to go to the hospital because of the prices of healthcare or treating yourself as an international student. And I realized that even till now, international students don't have public healthcare insurance in Manitoba. I don't know what the federal government is planning on doing about that.
This question often comes up about international students, and it's a challenging one. Canada appreciates and knows that we have to have international students. It's a way of contributing not just to our own growth, but to training up people who will be able to return to their countries and create more prosperity and opportunities within their countries as well, if that's what they choose to do. At the same time, education is really expensive in an objective way. And Canada massively subsidizes, with our tax dollars, every student who goes through universities. We have to prioritize Canadian citizens. Because Canadian citizens don't necessarily have the opportunity to go study somewhere else. We have to make sure that everyone in Canada can afford their education. And that's why, we try and keep international universities across the country, try and keep the barriers, the economic barriers, as low as possible for Canadians to be able to go and achieve their post-secondary studies. At the same time, we've noticed that there are a lot of people around the world who would love to come study in Canada. And we made the decision that our subsidies, what we pay as part of an education with tax dollars, should be going to Canadians first and foremost. And there are lots of international students out there who are willing to pay what the cost of a post-secondary education actually is. There are some who can't, but because money is not infinite and because we have to be fiscally responsible, we've allowed ourselves as a country to say, yes, international students can come, but it shouldn't be Canadian taxpayers paying for your studies. So there's something, I guess, a little bit unfair about that, in that, a worthy student from some faraway country, would really benefit from free or almost free access to Canadian universities, but we have to make choices about what we spend our tax dollars on. So it's more expensive, much more expensive, for international students to come to Canada. And part of that thinking means international students have to have health insurance, because the health insurance that we have, paid for by Canadian taxpayers through generations, needs to go to Canadians first. It's not always nice, it's not always fair, but there is a huge unfairness in the world that leaves Canadians luckier than 99.5% of everyone else in the world just because we happen to be born in this country. But we know that growing our population, increasing our diversity, bringing in immigration is a great thing. So we try and make it as easy as possible for international students, for permanent residents, for people to come in, and we'll continue to do that. But there are financial barriers that exist that we will continually look at trying to ease in ways that we can. But our priority needs to be on making sure that all Canadians have the access they need to health care, affordable public health care, and post-secondary education, because that's how we build a stronger future with the tax base we have. Okay, take a question from the center now. You in the very back in the white. Yes.
Hi there, my name is Sherry Skwarchuk. I'm Director of Developmental Studies here in the University of Winnipeg. I have a question about early childhood. Manitoba has high poverty rates, and 1 in 4 children are not ready for school, ready for life. In addition, if you consider Indigenous populations, that number drops to 1 in 2 being ready. And I know that there's been a lot of money put into childcare recently, which is fabulous. We could have a round of applause for that. However, I'm just concerned about where that money is going. We have a lot of what we would consider childcare deserts. The university here has a waiting list of over 200 children who cannot get access to good quality care and education. And I just would like to know what the plan is for making sure that in Manitoba, all children have the opportunity to be ready for school and life. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sherry. But of course, childcare is more than just making sure that kids are ready to start grade 1 or kindergarten in the best possible place. That's a huge goal, and it's extraordinarily powerful, and more and more studies show that giving kids that level playing field to start school leads to massively improved outcomes throughout the course of their life. So if that was the only reason, it would be worth it to do early childhood education. But of course, there's more reasons for that. Making sure that families Okay, let's be honest about it. Moms don't have to choose between their career and a family is a huge part of it as well. Giving that choice, because we know that no matter how much work we're doing on improving equality, the weight of child raising more often than not falls on the mom. But even more than just a question of gender equality and opportunity, it's a question of economic prosperity. Over the past year, we have seen the highest level of women's participation in the workforce that Canada has ever seen because we cut childcare fees in half across the country and even brought them down to $10 a day in 6 or 7 jurisdictions across the country. That is massive, and it's very timely at a time of labor shortages. So childcare has been at the top of the list of requests from 50 years ago in the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. And it took us a pandemic when everyone realized, oh my God, this is what happened when kids are at home. You can't be productive. For men and business people to understand that no, childcare is an economic responsibility and an economic good, not a social program. But when we signed historic childcare agreements with all the provinces, it wasn't just about $10 a day, which Manitoba has reached. But there were 3 conditions in that. Yes, get to $10 a day. But second, create more spaces, including spaces in culturally informed and language appropriate. So, pour la communauté francophone ici au Manitoba, for Indigenous communities, making sure that we're creating spaces in those areas. And the third one, which honestly I think Manitoba is challenged with right now, is proper pay and training for early childhood educators. That's one of the big drivers, our limiting factors that is creating these waiting lists. So there's a lot of work to do. We are there, we are watching. The money will only continue to flow as those 3 elements are being met. We do have certain strings and abilities to hold people to account on those, and we will continue to, because moving forward on childcare is a social policy, an economic policy, an equality policy, and mostly a opportunity for kids policy. And thank you very much for your question, Sherry. Okay. You in the pink, you have been waiting patiently since the very beginning with your hand up, so I couldn't miss out on you. And we are going to wrap up in about, I'm going to take 3 more questions after this, 1, 2, 3. But first I'm going to take your question in the sparkly pink, and then we'll go to 3 last questions.
Thank you.
Just for those of you who are wondering when you're going to get out of here, so it's, yep, it's on. Go ahead.
Hi. My name is Helen, and I am a small business owner. I'm a mother of 4, all under the age of 5.
Congratulations.
I wanted to ask the question about the Black business loan that was offered, or that you said a few years back. Unfortunately, as a Black business owner, those funding did not get to someone like me, as Black as I can be. I have applied to different banks, and one of the banks, Royal Bank, who told me that I was not qualified. And according to all the barriers that you guys were taking away for a Black business owner like me to have access to these funds, apparently, even with all of that taken away and with my high credit score, I still was not qualified. So my question here is, how are you really helping with the Black business owners, and especially starting with Manitoba, because around me, all I see is lots of Black business closing down, lack of funding, lack of support from the community, because I've also experience a high level of racism. I've been here since I was a teenager, but getting into the business world have opened my eyes to a whole different type of racism. I was pregnant, trying to give birth to my last son, and I was being bullied online by a Caucasian family who presently is taking me to small business claims court because I have to pay them back after they told me I don't speak English good enough. So my question is, do I speak English? And the next one is, how are you helping us move forward?
Helen, first of all, I'm going to make sure that one of my MPs, Kevin Lamoureux, because I think, or Dan, one of the two comes over and gets your information so we can follow up on your specific case on this, just because it doesn't sound right. The Black Entrepreneurship Strategy was actually a bit of a surprise to me. A few years ago, in 2017 or so, I sat down with leaders in the Black community from across the country to ask about what their top priorities was, what the federal government could do for them. And I'll be honest, I went in with preconceptions that they'd talk about the high incarceration rates of Black youth, which they did, that they'd talk around about discrimination challenges in their communities and the continuation of anti-Black racism that is continually recognized and appreciated in Canada, because we sort of shrug and say, well, we're not as bad as the United States, so we must be perfect then, which we are not, far from it. And what was a surprise to me was the number one ask from the Black community was access to capital. It was, we can't get loans, we can't get investors, we can't start up businesses, and it's a real problem because there is systemic discrimination working against us. So that's where we launched the Black Entrepreneurship Strategy. And it's far from perfect, but one of the things that we've done, as well as creating a foundation that is administered by Black-led organizations on funding to go, is a step in the right direction. But I will be honest, in my conversations with people across the country, like you, Helen, I hear that it might be a little more leaning towards supporting people in areas of concentration of Black community, like Toronto, Montreal, and even parts of Atlantic Canada, like Preston or Halifax. And it's not reaching enough Black community members out in the prairies and elsewhere. So I'm glad to hear about this challenge. No, I'm horrified to hear about the challenge you're facing. And thank you for bringing it to me. And I will make sure that we're following up, and then I go back to the people who are administrating this program and make sure that it is reaching communities like yours. Because if there is anyone who deserves that kind of boost, on top of the boosts that we're trying to give through 4 kids under 5 with a CCB, the Canada Child Benefit's probably doing pretty well on that, and we're going to continue working on it. Childcare is probably helping as well, but we need to make sure that you can not just get by, but that you can actually build that contribution to society that you want to do as an entrepreneur, and we will absolutely be there for you. So thank you for bringing that up, Helen. I will take 3 more questions. One from Yes You, waving at me, ma'am, in the red shirt, and then I will take a question from down here, you, sir, in the blue shirt, and a question from you in the back there. Here we go. There we go. All right, so starting with you in the back, and I'll take all 3 questions and I'll answer them one after the other. All 3 together. Sorry, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Mary Lou Bourgeois, and my question is going to be about a senior citizen issue. And my tale starts in 2019 when I lost my job because my boss lost his job in October. And then I was on EI, and then just before my EI ran out, CERB came in, COVID. So I was supposed to get a job, and I couldn't get a job, so I called CRA to see if I qualified. He said yes. So fine. So when I aged into 65, I applied for my GIS and was denied. I was then told anybody who went through CRA was denied, and anyone who went through Service Canada was forgiven and allowed to get the GIS. So for a whole year, I lived on $1,800 a month. And I went through, what the heck is that? To get donations and to survive on. So finally I get my GIS when I turned 66. So now I make $2,100, okay? I also get a subsidy for my rent, which I had to apply for. Now I have fibromyalgia and I'm diabetic. I don't feel like filling out forms every year, and I have to do that. And I just don't understand why I have to apply for money that the province gets from the federal government that I have to apply for. I don't understand why, as a senior citizen, why we can't get a living wage that's going to cover our expenses. Because right now, housing in Winnipeg is terrible. I have to pay regular rent, so I don't move, and I don't want to move because I'm scared to move into an apartment block that's infested with bed bugs. I already went through that, and I never want to go through it again because, number one, I just don't have that kind of energy to deal with that kind of problem. So I want to know why our government is not looking at senior citizens' cost of living. The cost of living is going higher than what our pensions are. I worked a whole lifetime to put into this government also. I paid taxes. I had deductions docked off my wages, okay? And so I don't see why, as a senior citizen, we are not allowed to have a wage that we can live on. I'm tired. Right now, I'm getting $100 a month from the Manitoba Métis Federation for food. And that money all goes on meat. June is the deadline for that to end. I don't know what I'm going to do then, okay? Because I'm just barely making it enough. I barely make enough money. I just make enough money to pay my bills and buy food and maybe go out for coffee, okay? So I don't know why you're not looking at that. We've had raises for the children, and I don't begrudge that. I was all for that, but I think as a senior citizen, we all need the same thing. There's so many senior citizens out there that they don't, I feel lucky actually, because I've got the MMF giving me that money. But there's a lot of people out there that don't have that little extra credit. I'm being subsidized for my rent, so I'm lucky there. So, but I don't understand why, if we have to apply for that, why the government just can't give us that much money instead of us having to go to our provincial government to ask for money that they got from the federal government. Good.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Lou. I'm going to take the other two questions. I will come back to your answer. Go ahead, sir in blue. No, sorry, behind you.
Bonsoir, Monsieur Trudeau, et bienvenue à Winnipeg.
Merci.
Plusieurs Canadiennes et Canadiens perdent confiance dans notre système électoral. Et nous sommes dans un ère très divisé, très divisif.
Pardon, tu t'appelles comment?
Pardon?
Tu t'appelles comment?
Richard Goulet. Oui, pardon. Plusieurs personnes pensent qu'une réforme du système électoral serait une bonne mesure pour changer la confiance des Canadiens, surtout des jeunes, dans le système électoral. Alors, avez-vous des plans? Et si vous en avez, pouvez-vous nous apporter plus de détails? My question relates to electoral reform and plans and details relating to that. Merci.
Merci, Richard. And last question, you in the green shirt. Yep.
Hello, Honorable Prime Minister. My question is that which economic sanctions Canada will apply on China if our Canadian defense organizations find out that China is providing weapons to Russia during its war against Ukraine. And it seems to me that China is becoming good ally with Russia and Iranian regime and maybe with Taliban. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And what was your name, sorry?
Noor Ahmadzai.
Noor. Thank you, Noor. Okay, starting with you, Mary Lou. Listen, I'm so sorry to hear the challenges you're going through. After a lifetime of work, things should be easier for you now. I know there's no question about that. We've been through some tough years. Canada's actually done pretty well over the past couple of decades at reducing seniors' poverty, which is a step in the right direction. But as you point out, there's a lot more to do. I can't speak to the provincial side of things. It does have an important responsibility to make sure that seniors are doing well, and there are some provinces that do that far better than others. But I can speak a little bit to something the federal government is deciding to do, is doing that is going to make things easier, and that's automatic tax filing. That's going to make sure that, as you talk about having to fill out forms and paperwork, that lower-income Canadians or Canadians on fixed incomes or with predictable tax situations don't have to go through the hassle of refiling and rejustifying every year, and that we're much more proactive about reaching out and ensuring that you're getting the support that you deserve and that you need. There's something to be said for using the ability and the technologies that we have at our fingertips to deliver better services to citizens, whether it's passports or EI or seniors benefits. We are working very much on that at the federal level, but one of the things that we're going to be able to do is with this automatic tax filing, you will find it easier to get everything that is coming to you with fewer hassles and stress in your life, and we'll continue to look at ways to increase supports for seniors because we know things are squeezed for you and far too many people like you. So thank you, Mary Lou, for bringing that up. Richard, sur la réforme électorale, a number of people remember that I made a commitment in 2015 that I wanted 2015 to be the last election done with first past the post. First past the post is a system whereby people often end up having to pick the least worst of the options out there. If they really don't want the blue party to win, they look at who has a better choice between the red party and the orange party, and they vote for whichever one they think might have the better support, because they're worried that if they vote for the Green Party, for example, the blue party is going to slip in instead of either the red or the orange. I'm using colors, but they're fairly transparent in the way I think about that. Just judging from the room, that's a reflection that a fair number of people might be going through at various levels. That's not ideal. I always felt that you should be able to pick the person you think or the party you think would be the best, and if that person doesn't get elected first, well, you should have a second choice. So you'd really like for there to be a Green MP, but if the Green doesn't win, you'd rather it be a red or an orange than helping the blue. That's what a ranked ballot or a single transferable vote is all about. And that's what I think would be a massive improvement to our electoral system. So people would actually try to find common ground with their other parties to sort of say, look, let me be your second choice. I know you're going to vote for your neighbor who's running for that other party because you're good friends with them. But can I be your second choice? Because I'll be a good MP. And that reaching out to be someone's second choice is a really good improvement over our electoral system. At the same time, I don't like the idea of people being elected off of lists. MPs right now are accountable to the members who elect, the citizens who elect them, and everyone who lives in their district. They're not accountable to the back rooms of a political party who generate a list that allow you to get elected and to move forward. I like the fact that our finance minister, when election time comes, has to stand outside of the local IGA and shake hands on the way in. There's something about having that direct contact with voters that I think proportional representation takes away. So I feel very strongly that a ranked ballot is the kind of change that would improve Canada significantly. Well, in 2015, I had a majority, and I had the opportunity to bring that in. But I also know, and this goes to something I said earlier, that it's an important principle that one government that does something should at least theoretically be able to be undone by another government, because that's the essence of democracy. It should be hard to undo good things. But when you change the way a government is elected, if it has unforeseen consequences, if it ends up being bad for the country, it'd actually be really hard to change it back, because the new system, by definition, is a system that would give the next government that might not want to undo that change. So for me, Richard, it was really important that there be a multi-party consensus around electoral reform. And I tried, through the extent of that majority, from 2015 to 2019, to see if we couldn't get consensus around ending first past the post. And the NDP and the Greens were fiercely in favor of proportional representation, which I think would be bad for Canada. So, and they didn't like the idea of ranked ballot because it wasn't a big enough change to our electoral system. And I had to face a choice between breaking an electoral promise that really mattered to me, to change the way we do elections, or to accept that it had to be done with consensus across party lines if I was going to be a responsible leader. So I chose to not follow up on that promise. And I regret it, and I have said time and time again that the minute any party wants to come forward and say, let's do a ranked ballot so people can, it reflects how we think about things anyway. We automatically rank the different choices in our mind. This would be my first choice, this would be my second choice. Then we have to think strategically, okay, but does this person have a chance of winning? That's how we end up as a progressive country with less than progressive governments because of first past the post. But I will not change our electoral system without a form of consensus, because that would be irresponsible leadership. And I believe in serious, responsible leadership. So I had to break that promise. But like I said, I wasn't going to just tick a box to keep a promise at the risk of hurting our country for years to come. The second another party comes forward and says, let's look at a single transferable vote, let's look at a ranked ballot, I'll be there and end first past the post if we get consensus. But until that moment, I'm going to continue to focus on affordability, cost of living, growing the economy, bringing in a critical mineral strategy, making sure that we're a beacon of democracy around the world, and showing that diversity and resilience is everything. And that's what I will keep focused on, making sure that Mary Lou and others are getting the support they need. And I won't spend too much time on electoral reform like I just spent right now for all the people who are, unlike Richard, who don't particularly care about electoral reform, because that's also one of the realities that you know at dinner parties when you bring up electoral reform. Everyone, oh no, here he goes again. I'm that guy too, but there are other things we have to work on. But thank you for your question. Merci. And then Noor, one of the conversations we had just this past weekend at the G7 in Japan was about sanctions avoidance. We stepped up as a G7, as democracies around the world, to make sure that Russia bore a heavy cost and continues to bear a heavy cost as long as it continues its illegal invasion of Ukraine. Not just because we stand with Ukraine, but because we know that Russia cannot profit, cannot benefit from having overturned decades of stability in the rules-based international order. So we've put massive sanctions on the Russian economy that have come with real consequences for the Russian people, for the Russian leadership, the Russian oligarchs who enable Putin. And one of the things that we were discussing over the weekend is those countries and those businesses who are avoiding the sanctions the global community has put on Russia for having violated the UN Charter and for continuing to perpetrate war crimes against innocent Ukrainians. I mean, there's a lot of people talking about peace out there, but here's a thought experiment. If you want the war to stop, what happens if Ukrainians were to put down their weapons tomorrow? Russia would continue to occupy and subjugate and take away the sovereignty and territory of the Ukrainian people. If Russia were to put down its weapons tomorrow, what would happen? Ukraine would take back its borders, the Ukrainian people would be free, and the United Nations Charter would be respected. It is easy to see peace. Russia's just got to stop sending missiles at Kyiv and sending its soldiers to conquer Ukrainian territory. And that's why we are very much looking at consequences for any countries that continue to go around the global sanctions, where we have the power to say, you don't get to continue to engage with us profitably if behind the world's backs, you're also profiting from Russia at this time. People are going to have to make choices. Do you stand with the international rules-based order? Do you stand with the UN Charter? Or do you stand with chaos and might makes right? That's why Zelensky, when I saw him this weekend, specifically said thank you, not just to Canada, but to Canadians for standing so strongly with Ukraine for as long as it takes, with as much as it takes. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Noor. Merci, Richard. Merci tous vos questions. Thank you very much for what ended up being a later evening than we all thought. It was a real pleasure to see you, Winnipeg. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. Merci tout le monde.